Hello, and welcome to the Food Security for Equitable Futures expert interview video series, where we interview experts in the area of food insecurity to gain a non technical overview of this pressing social problem and ways to address it. I'm Charumita Vasudev, and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at Lancaster University. I'm also a qualitative research scholar on the project, and I'm very happy to have with us today a leading expert in the area of food insecurity. Hello, Professor, and welcome. Can I please ask you to introduce yourself, starting with your name, your current affiliation, and your areas of expertise?
Thanks, Charumita. My name is Deepa Sinha. I'm based in Delhi in India. I currently teach in a university called Ambedkar University, Delhi, teaching economics. I've been working on issues related to food rights and nutrition for almost 20 years now in various capacities, right from the community level to policy advocacy and research. I also work on other aspects of social policy and gender, mainly concerned with India.
Thank you. Can you elaborate a little bit about on your experience of working on food insecurity, particularly what aspects of food insecurity that you work on, and if there is a geographical area that you particularly focus on?
Yeah, so my work on food security has been largely with the Right to Food campaign in India, which is a large network of individuals and organizations across the country. The network was formed in the early 2000s as an sort of an offshoot outcome of a Supreme Court public interest litigation on the right to food. So when we started, we were working mainly on various welfare schemes that the government has to ensure that nobody goes hungry. And my areas of interest was mainly related to child malnutrition. And as we know, there are multiple determinants of child malnutrition, of which food security is one of the main. That's how it began. But over the years, my work has expanded to look at food security at the household level, linking it with broader economic trends, production, agriculture, and so on.
You mentioned multiple determinants of child malnutrition. Could you please talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there are some now very well accepted frameworks also which help us understand the determinants of child malnutrition. And of course, child undernutrition itself is looked at as both chronic as well as acute and measured differently. So when we are talking about chronic undernutrition, it would be manifested in the form of stunting, which is that children have a height which is lower than what would be considered normal for that age group, whereas wasting is acute malnutrition, which is that children are too thin. The determinants are slightly different for both, but overall, what we do know is that it's a combination of food and health, which result in the kind of nutrition that a child or an adult finally has in terms of nutrition outcomes. And these are then in turn affected, of course, by a number of other factors, such as, especially in the case of children, it would include the care that the child is receiving, access to water, sanitation, to help them be away from infections. And all of these then, in the case of children, because they are not independent and cannot access these on their own, would depend on the status of the woman, both within the household and in society, because in most countries, it is the mother who is seen to be the primary caregiver of children. So both through the intergenerational effect of, if the mother is more healthy, then the child is born healthier, but also that because it is the mother taking care of the child, if she has a better status, it has been shown that then children have better outcomes of health and nutrition. So it's a combination of all of this which finally results in what you see in terms of stunting or wasting.
Great, thank you. You've spoken a little bit about your research area. Could you please share an important finding from your research, and why do you think that is an important finding?
So I think linking to what I just ended with, when one of the things that, of course, we read in the literature also, but what I learned both from my own research data as well as years of field experience is this: how important gender relations are for nutrition outcomes as well as for food security of the household. And this is something where we often think of it more in the former sense of the mother's health or her anemia status affecting the birth weight of the child and so on. But it's much more than that. It is, for instance, in terms of what a family decides to grow, what it decides to sell, what they decide to consume within the household, what food they buy, how much time they have for children. All of this depends on women and their status. Also, in terms of just food production, we know that across the world now, women contribute the most to both production and processing of food, and make decisions which are not often the same that men would make in a similar situation. So I would say one of the biggest learnings for me has been on this broader status of women and how it impacts both food security and nutrition. And then what would that mean for policy if you had um, uh, looked at food security and nutrition policy from a gender lens?
Um, and that links up to my next question. We know that you've been closely working with the Right to Food campaign. So could you tell us more about that, and especially about how social and civil society movements can help sort of to contribute towards policy?
So the Right to Food campaign, like I was saying, came out of this public interest litigation in the Supreme Court in 2001, where one civil society group called the People's Union for Civil Liberties went to the Supreme Court in a context where in India we saw a number of starvation deaths. It was 2 years of drought in most parts of the country. And at the same time, the public stock holding, that is what the government had in its own stocks of food grains, was about 60 million tons, which is quite a bit, which is enough for one whole year of requirements through the public distribution system that we have. So the case in the court was basically arguing that if there is, on the one side, the government itself has so much grain, and on the other hand, you have people who are dying because they're not eating for a number of days continuously, that goes against the right to life that our constitution guarantees to its citizens. Out of this came out a number of very strong orders, and many of those had to do with what the state can do to directly ensure that there is no situation of starvation. So it included things like the public distribution system through which the government gives subsidized grains to the poor, the school meals, uh, another program for children in the preschool and earlier ages. And the civil society campaigns around food first began in trying to ensure that these orders are implemented on the ground. So, for instance, if the court said that every school that's run by the government should provide a hot cooked meal every day, just because there was an order from the Supreme Court, that did not happen. What happened was that a large number of groups across the country, which were already working on child rights or food rights or various socioeconomic rights, used these orders of the Supreme Court as a tool to mobilize people on the ground, to mobilize media attention, and networked to make this a national campaign to ensure that this actually happened. So that's how it sort of began. And there was a lot of strength to the Supreme Court orders, I believe, because of the civil society campaign that arose alongside with it, which mobilized people and popular opinion in favor of these orders being implemented. That is sort of led towards a campaign for a legislation on the food security, where we had a National Food Security Act in 2013. And through our process of debates and discussions around what this act should look like, we engaged with farmers groups, which labor unions, newer groups which were earlier not so centrally part of this, and made the connections between also decentralized food production, climate change and environmental issues, and gender, of course, across all of these. And how we can bring all of this together, that you have a model where people's food security and right to food is ensured, but in a way in which it is just and equitable overall to society also. And that for that, you don't only look at what the government is directly providing in terms of various food programs, but also the entire food system, including the production, the value chains, the rights of farmers, and so on. So it's broadly now a number of areas, but what it has also meant is that a number of different civil society campaigns, unions, organizations coming together to try and build this vision of what it would look like in the case of India.
Thank you. That's very interesting. You're talking about the food systems and various interlinkages. So, and these are not only at the local or the state, national level, but also at global levels. So, can you talk about some global event that you think is, or even a national level event that you think is affecting the pressing situation of food insecurity in India right now?
Um, so various things one can think of. Global event, obviously, what comes to mind is the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the effect that it had. And that's something that affected India as well, because there are certain crops which are essential, like pulses and edible oils, that we depend on imports for. India is not self-sufficient in their production, and therefore there is an inflation in prices where when any sort of global crisis occurs. So one aspect of, I think, the issue of food security within India also is the availability of grains at an affordable price. So while we do have grains now available, and it's often talked about, India's talked about as being a food secure country, because at least as far as staples are concerned, there is no shortage technically. But I think affordability is equally important. So, and affordability comes from two things: the prices as well as the incomes that people are earning, right? So, and here, if you look at the FAO statistics for India, about 70% of people, FAO estimates, cannot afford what they call a healthy diet. Right. So if we are talking about food security as being not just about not feeling the physical pangs of hunger, but having access to diversified diets which would help a person be well nourished, then affordability becomes very important. And that's a big issue there. And that I would link with your question of anything that nationally that affects food security. I think the fact that there's such a large proportion of people in India working in the informal sector, earning very low wages and also very irregular, I mean, with a lot of fluctuation in their wages, combined with other than staples and everything, that's a huge volatility in prices that we see because of various global economic factors. It makes people vulnerable whenever there is an economic shock to food insecurity as well. And the most recent we saw this happening was in the case of COVID, where because of the COVID induced lockdowns, we saw that this really affected the kind of food people were able to afford and buy and consume.
I want to link this to what you were talking about some time back about the it not being an availability issue. We have a lot of grain in stock. So could you please talk a little bit more about what are the barriers to access that people face where they cannot access? One is livelihoods that you were talking about, informality of livelihoods. But are there other barriers that people face to be able to access the grain which is there in our country in plenty?
So, as far as grain is concerned, the staples are concerned, it is slightly better in the sense that because we also have a very massive public distribution system through which from this year, actually, those who have the what we call ration cards, which determines that they're eligible to get the state support, people get about 5 kilograms per month per person for free from the state. And this we have found is a huge support because it's also an income support. It frees up money for people to buy other food items. But as far as the public distribution system is concerned, there is still an issue of exclusions. So not everybody who needs it has a ration card. And this happens because of a number of reasons, including that people don't have the documentation to prove that they're poor or that they're residents of the area in which they're living. It also has to do with the fact that the number of cards to be distributed was determined based on data from 2011, whereas the population has increased. Even the families which have cards have seen births and expansions to their families, but those names have not been included. So the grain they get is not as much as they should be getting. So there are different reasons why exclusions happen. There are also some implementation issues with the scheme where it could be localized corruption in some places. In some places, because it is linked to a biometric verification of the identity of the person, sometimes if that doesn't match for any reason, then they don't get their entitlement. So there are all these reasons because of which you still have some people who do not access as much grains as they should, despite having the public distribution system. If we just expand the idea of food security to include other foods, then the issues of affordability and volatility in prices as well as availability become quite stark. Like I was saying, pulses, which are the main source of protein in Indian diets, for pulses, we are dependent on imports. So they're not equally available across the country. Same with oil seeds, which is the main source of fat. Animal proteins are still very expensive, not evenly available everywhere. So a number of other factors come in if you start looking at the other foods, which are also essential. Fruits and vegetables, there are issues of storage, and again, therefore, availability across seasons. So each of these would then open up a whole set of issues on why, and all of that combined result in the diets being heavily cereal focused and not having enough to meet the other nutrition needs and especially micronutrients as well.
Yes, thank you. So this leads me really naturally to my next question. We know that you've worked on malnutrition quite a bit, and could you please talk about the relationship of food insecurity with malnourishment, and what are the overlaps? Are there any particular differences, and especially focusing on what your work has been on malnourishment?
So, like we were discussing in the beginning of this conversation, that malnutrition itself has multiple determinants. I just want to place that again, that one understands that. But in the context of India, food security continues to be an important determinant. Why I'm emphasizing this is there is often a debate, particularly in government programs, that especially when it comes to child malnutrition, and that is the focus for programs addressing malnutrition, because reversing undernutrition after the childhood period is quite difficult. The argument given often is that there's so little that children eat, that with increasing economic growth and reducing poverty in India, that food security is not a problem anymore, and therefore that the problem is more to do with feeding practices, even in the case of food. While there are certain issues with feeding practices, for instance, the exclusive breastfeeding rate in India is still less than 50%. The time at which complementary feeding begins is later than it should happen. These exist. But what we have seen is that along with that, the household food security also continues to matter. Like I was saying earlier, while there might be a grain security, what is still not available is the diverse diets that are required to meet the nutrition requirements, including for children. So even though children eat very little, they require a diverse set of foods. And that is something you find lacking in the diet. So if you look at the National Family Health Survey, the latest data, which is for 2 years back, which gives us a figure on the proportion of children in the age group of 6 months to 2 years who meet what the WHO defines as an adequate diet. So that is a combination of the number of times that they're fed in a day and the number of food groups from which they're consuming. And the WHO has certain norms on what the minimum is. Only 11% of children in this age group in India get a minimum acceptable diet as defined by the WHO, which tells us that food continues to be a problem. While everything else also is important, it's important that open defecation is reduced, which is reducing. It is important that access to healthcare is improved. Along with that, it is also important to continue to focus on food to ensure, and when I say food, I'll keep repeating that it's not just grains that I'm talking about, on everything that needs to go into the plate. And you see that there are gaps in that at the household level. And then within the household, because of patriarchal norms, because of everything else that we spoke of, you see that the intra-household distribution is also not really equal. When there is not enough, there is a preference for adult men because they are seen to be the people who have to go out and work. Amongst older children, more for boys than girls. These are the kind of discriminations that happen within the household. The woman doesn't have time for care and breastfeeding and so on because she is involved in multiple forms of work. So all of these also contribute to finally the food security for the child, which then contributes to the malnutrition outcomes. So broadly, even when we talk about malnutrition, it is multiple factors. which does not mean that food is not important or that part of the problem is resolved, but it is food plus other things.
Right. That's a very important point. And do you feel that with COVID, when there was a loss of employment and livelihoods became all the more precarious, do you think there was an effect on this situation? Did you think it worsened the situation? And have there been any long-term impacts, so to say, even after 2 years of COVID?
So definitely during COVID, the situation of food security worsened, particularly for people in the informal sector, and also in some ways, surprisingly, for people, the urban poor much more than in rural areas, which probably had to do with also the lockdowns and people in urban areas being much more dependent on the market for their food than in rural areas. And we know this through also the Right to Food campaign did 2 rounds of surveys, which we call the Hunger Watch surveys across the country in rural and urban areas, where we asked people. So it was a perception-based survey, but we asked people compared to pre-COVID time what they felt their food security situation was. In the first survey that we did, about 2/3 of the people said that they were worse off than before COVID. The second survey, which we did about 2 years after, said 40% still said that they were worse off compared to before COVID. And when you looked at what are the kinds of coping mechanisms that people had for this situation, and they were mostly worse off because they lost employment and did not get back employment at the level at which they had before COVID happened. What were the coping mechanisms? Largely, the coping mechanisms was to cut down on these other sort of foods that we talked about, which are more expensive. So we had a number of households where they said that they earlier could afford to buy milk for their children, or they could have milk in their tea, and that they stopped doing it. Or families which said that they might have had an egg once a week, but they reduced that to once a month. Some households which said that they just stopped eating chicken or meat or any animal foods. So these were the coping mechanisms that were reported. We've not done a systematic survey in 23, but what we are seeing on the field is that the full recovery has still not happened. Also because while we came out of COVID and came out of the lockdowns, other issues continue to happen. Like inflation is very high since the last 1 year. Wages are still not as much as, have not caught up in the full sense. And therefore, all this would, one assumes, have long-term impacts, but we don't have any outcome studies that are available currently, in the sense that we have these kind of surveys on asking people's perceptions and what they're eating, but we still don't have surveys which have done anthropometric measurement, for instance, looking at heights and weights and so on. But just by what we are seeing, we do feel that at least in some communities which are vulnerable, one might see very long-term effects of this insecurity that has been induced by COVID, more so the lockdowns than COVID, but yeah, they came together.
It is an important point about uh, people cutting down on more costlier foods and shifting to more affordable foods. Uh, could you tell me a little bit more about the communities that you are saying are vulnerable, and who are these specific groups that are particularly vulnerable in these areas?
So like I was saying, one big group that we have seen was quite vulnerable is the urban poor. So although their wages are higher than their rural counterparts, when there is an economic shock or when there's something like COVID, we found that they're also very vulnerable because they're immediately cut off from access to any kind of resources, especially in big cities like the city of Delhi, where I live. Where the kind of work that people are engaged in is, say, domestic. The women are largely in domestic work, and the men are in various kinds of daily wage work. They could be slightly skilled, or many of them work as head loaders or in construction sites and so on. So these are people the men are usually going out every day and looking for work. Some days they find work, some days they don't. And then what they end up eating, what the family ends up eating, really then depends on whether on that day the man found work or not. And even in the case of women, domestic work is hard work, so with very low pay. So you have women working in multiple houses, and that also sort of declined a bit after COVID. At least immediately after, we have studies which show that one is people didn't want domestic workers coming into their houses. Also during the lockdown, people bought washing machines and dishwashers and vacuum cleaners and things which they did not have earlier, and therefore did not need as much domestic help as they needed. So these are one set of communities. The other traditionally vulnerable communities in rural areas, like in particular tribal areas which are cut off, do not have access to markets, they continue to earlier depended a lot on common property resources and forests and so on. So access to these resources have also been reducing, which reduces their dietary diversity. On the other hand, their incomes and access to markets have not been increasing at an equal pace for them to substitute what they were, say, collecting from the forest with what they can buy from the market. So that's another vulnerable group. Demographically, you find that it's particularly old people, single women, households which have a disabled member. These are, again, groups which find it difficult because they're not earning a regular income often.
Okay, thank you. So, and we've talked a little bit about social policies and their effect on food insecurity. I would like to ask you a little bit more about not just policies that are directly targeted at food, but other things like we have Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, or free LPG provisions, subsidized fertilizer provisions. A lot of these facts, sort of policies, link up to the food systems that we've been talking about and feed into food insecurity. So, could you tell us a little bit more about how policies impact food security for people more broadly?
So firstly, and this is sort of really broadly, but also the economic model and the kind of growth we are having has quite a direct impact on food security, because right from the beginning, we've been talking about livelihoods and wages. And if your growth model is one which is not creating employment, which is the case in many parts of the world, including India. So we have had growth in our GDP from the 90s, particularly from the 2000s onwards. But this has also been a period which has been accompanied by unemployment increasing. So although we have growth happening, it's not creating enough jobs. And again, in a country like ours, or in most parts of the world, wage employment is the main source of income for most people. So if the growth is not creating that employment, then you're already in crisis. You start there, right? And when you are there, then the direct welfare schemes are often what we also call, say, social protection schemes, which are sort of in response to this crisis. While they're very important, they don't go to the root of the problem, but those, we definitely need them to exist as long as this is the kind of growth that we continue to have, which is where you would come in, something like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act comes in, which provides 100 days of employment per household on demand when people require employment. There are a lot of implementation issues there, but if it really works the way the scheme was envisaged, and during COVID, we saw that it helped a lot of people because it provided work where no other work was available, and that work contributed to creating assets. But in urban areas, let's say, you don't have an equivalent program. And we just talked about the vulnerability of the urban poor. But if they are not finding work, we don't have an urban employment guarantee program. Some states have recently started trying it. Similarly, social security pensions become very important. Again, if most people are working in the formal sector, when they have a disability related to, say, an accident or something, or when they get old, they get some sort of a pension, or they have contributed to a pension fund. But when more than 70% of your labor force is in the informal sector, the day they stop working, they get nothing. We do have social security pension schemes in the form of old age pensions and pensions for single women, but the amounts are really small. In rupees, it's around 500 rupees to 1,000 rupees per month, again, depending on different states. These are not inflation indexed. They are not enough to meet even the very basic expenses for people who have zero savings, because what they earned through their life was just about enough to meet their needs, current needs. So that is, again, something that becomes very important. Just if I can take a minute, a little bit on the production side also, that again, in a country like India, where you have still more than 40% of people who are dependent on agriculture for their livelihood. So we also have this strange kind of contradiction, right? That on the one side, you have a lot of people who earn their livelihood from agriculture, for whom the returns to agriculture has to be high, which means that the prices can't be too low. On the other hand, you have a whole set of people who don't earn enough to buy food, and therefore, if the prices are too high, then it will hurt them, which is where again policy comes in. So you cannot leave it to the market, because the market will fail on one side or the other, and both can be disastrous. If the farmers don't get enough price, we will not have enough production. We'll have to start importing, which for the country of our size would be very expensive and unsustainable. On the other hand, if it becomes too expensive, then people will not be able to buy the food. And that's where things like the public distribution system and the school meals and so on come, through which the state can mediate in this market, where they buy at a fair price from the farmers but provide to the consumers at a subsidized rate. So, and there's so many other things one can think of within the agricultural sector itself that needs to be done to improve its productivity and improve farmers' income. It doesn't have to be only through prices. If productivity increases, also their incomes would go on. So many of this will take us back to what I began with, which is the larger economic model in which we are functioning, where who is the priority? Is it towards, only growth as the measure, and therefore looking at profits and growth rates at any cost, or an employment-centric, equitable sort of model, which might look very different? And one of the ways in which I think it will look very different is that it would be very decentralized, both in the production and the distribution systems that will be there, compared to the kind of centralized food system that we are moving towards.
Can I please take you to my next question then? What do you think is the biggest gap in food insecurity research? What do you think, is there a gap in measurement of food insecurity? What do you think we need more research on to be able to solve the problems that we are talking about?
So in terms of research, sometimes one hears that you people are not saying anything new. 20 years back also, you were saying there are all these determinants and all of this has to be done, which is true, but it's also true that they've not been done. Therefore, one has to keep repeating that there's nothing that has happened to prove any of this wrong. It's just that it has not been done, which takes us into a number of political and economic factors. But despite that, even directly, one is what you said about measurement. There is a huge data gap currently, especially in India. We don't have dietary surveys. We do not actually know what is it that people are eating. We're dependent on very dated sort of data on consumption patterns and so on. So that is required, because that really helps again, given the diversity within the country, unless we have disaggregated data, because the response cannot be the same everywhere, right? So we need to have regular data which is at a disaggregated level to be able to design policies accordingly. The other area of research, I think, is that now in theory, in this whole area of food security, not just in India but globally, there is an increasing understanding that you need to take a food systems approach. That you cannot look at these things in silos, that production cannot be looked at separately from say processing, and that separately from healthy diets and so on. But in that context, I think the kind of research that is required is a lot more sort of action research and policy research on how, if you take a food system approach, what would that mean for policies? So therefore, if you have a crop diversification policy, which is nutrition sensitive and environment sensitive, what will that look like for North India? Or what will that look like for West India? These kind of very specific questions, I think there is still a lot of scope, given the broader, progress that we have made in the theoretical understanding of food systems. Similarly, the other end of nutrition, undernutrition, which is over nutrition in quotes, is the increasing consumption of processed and ultra processed foods, which is also again happening not only amongst the rich, but across the board, which sometimes has the same factors behind it as undernutrition, which is to do with affordability and access and so on. That end we are not researching enough either.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned action research. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on that? What it entails and how can researchers incorporate more of action-oriented things in their research?
Action research, in my opinion, can be of two types. One is what we traditionally do as evaluation research in terms of, like trying out an intervention and seeing whether it works or not. And it doesn't necessarily have to be as a randomized controlled trial. There are so many other ways in which you can do, and often small models done both either by the government or civil society give us a lot of insights to what sort of policy can have. I mean, you have to dirty your hands sometimes to know what works and what doesn't work. So that kind of thing. For instance, we worked on having childcare facilities which provided nutrition with kitchen gardens and so on, and what that meant. And then we used that to advocate with state governments to introduce that as part of their nutrition programs. As a person who's part of these larger campaigns, I think just conducting descriptive, just finding out the situation can also be action research sometimes. When you involve local youth, people from the community in finding out about these things in a systematic manner, be it through a social audit or be it through just a simple survey like the Hunger Watch survey that we did. And then when you know through the data that 80% in your community are saying, let's say that they are not getting the school meal, that also sort of provokes action. It becomes a tool around which you can mobilize people, which is not traditionally how academics think of action research. But one has often found that as part of mobilization, research is a very useful tool many times, both for people on the ground to understand what's going on around them, which they of course know intuitively just from experience, but doing it systematically adds a lot of value. It also contributes to mobilization around the issue.
So, Professor Deepa, what is the next plan, future plans of research for you?
Well, one part of it is, like I said, to just continue working on these issues, to continue looking at it, but from a wider food systems approach. So far, my research has largely been on the welfare schemes, but increasingly I see the links with the entire food system. So to do that much more would be part of what I would look to see as we go ahead. And the other issue that continues to interest me is the role of women. So we have had a few studies on looking at how you can include women in decision making on what to produce, how to distribute, and what impact that has on nutrition. So taking that forward as well would be another area of interest.
Great, thank you. We look forward to following your work, and it was great interacting with you today. And thank you so much for giving us your time. And yeah, these are all the questions I have for you today. And we really look forward to reading more of your work.
Thank you. Thanks.